Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm the event director and a bookseller at Literati bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Devi Lockwood in support of 1001 Voices on Climate Change, Everyday Stories of Flood, Fire, Drought, and Displacement from around the world, and in conversation this evening with Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha. If you are just joining us, a quick webinar overview for you as attendees. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open as I will be dropping links to purchase the book from our store throughout the event. And you can use the Q&A feature on your toolbar to submit questions at any time. I will ask the selection of those questions at the conclusion of the conversation on your behalf. And live transcription is available to you on the toolbar as well. Should you need it, you can just click the CC icon that's there as well. And of course, if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books directly in the description below me. You can also subscribe to catch more of our events after they air live. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And of course, if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. Most of all, we'd just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. And so without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's author and our moderator this evening. Devi Lockwood has written about science, climate change, and technology for the New York Times, The Guardian, Slate, and the Washington Post, among others. She spent 5 years traveling in 20 countries on 6 continents to document 1001 stories on water and climate change, funded in part by the Gardner and Shaw postgraduate traveling fellowships from Harvard and a National Geographic early career grant. Lockwood graduated Phi Beta Kappa summa cum laude from Harvard, where she studied folklore and mythology and earned a language citation in Arabic. In 2019, she completed an MS in science writing at MIT. She's editor for Rest of World and splits her time between New York and Vermont. And Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, MD, MPH, FAAP, is a physician, scientist, and activist, has been called to testify twice before the United States Congress, awarded the Freedom of Expression and Courage Award by PEN America, and named one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. She's also the author of What the Eyes Don't See, a story of crisis, resistance, and hope in an American city. Please join me in welcoming Devi and Dr. Mona into your living rooms.
Thank you, John, for that warm welcome. I'm so excited to be having this discussion with Devi, and I have tons of exciting questions, and we look forward to all of your questions. But let's start with a reading. So, Devi, give us a passage and tell us why you picked this passage.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you all so much for being here. This is a true honor. I'm stoked to be in conversation with you tonight. So I wanted to start with a brief reading from Thailand and then zoom back out to talk about a bit of kind of the why I took this trip. But I will just jump right in. The section's called Migration. Water is movement. Mess with the amount of water available in one location and people will move if they must. We all need a steady and semi-predictable supply of water in order to survive. Soon is a modern dancer who moved to Bangkok from the rural north. He relocated to the city in part to practice his art, but also to take refuge from unpredictable rain patterns. Farming in Thailand is governed by the monsoon season, a shift in the direction of prevailing winds that dump rain, fill river basins, and irrigate crops from roughly May to September, or at least they used to. When we spoke in late May of 2016, it was dry in Thailand. The seasonal rains were delayed. Water levels in the country's biggest dams plummeted to less than 10% of their capacity, the worst drought in 2 decades. Right now, it's supposed to be the beginning of the rainy season, but there is no rain, Soon told me. How can I say it? I think the balance of the weather is changing. Some parts have a lot of rain, but some parts have none. He leaned back in his chair, expressing the dryness and imbalance with his hands moving like a fulcrum scale. That's the problem. The people who used to be farmers have come to Bangkok because they want money and they want work, he said. There's no more work because of the weather. Migration to the city, in other words, is hastened by the rain. And I'll do one more kind of short section from that same chapter, just to kind of focus on a bit more of people's voices from other parts. Pollution was on the tip of many people's tongues. Asked to speak about water, it was the first thing that came to mind. In Bangkok, a woman spoke to me in front of her home on Lat Phra Road, in front of Klong San Sap, a canal. The canal was not this smelly in the past, but now even a drop of water splashing when a boat passes by smells so bad, she said. She told me that the day before she had overheard two men talking about this, and one of them said, "Do you want to go back home by boat?" "No, I don't want to," he replied. "Yesterday, water splashed on me and it smelled awful." I was so embarrassed, the woman told me. In the past, it wasn't like this. I lived here for 20 years and the smell keeps getting worse. The canal is long, and the canal nearby around Mainburi district doesn't smell so bad. I don't know why it smells bad here in the city, but I've been here for so long. In Ayutthaya, a high school student told me that this city, previously Thailand's capital, is surrounded by 3 rivers. One of them has been used for centuries as a source of fish, water, drainage, and recreation. The water condition is not as good in Thailand as it was in the past, because in the past the water was clear, she told me. In Thai history, they say that we could see fish in the water, but now we could not see them because of all this pollution. She didn't specify which kind. And so, I don't know, people are conscious of toxins accumulating in the bodies of water that they know best, and conscious of the ways that climate is also impacting those changes as well. And I think one of the things I was trying to do in traveling for so long and in so many places that might be considered remote or far off the map or off the beaten track was just to diversify the idea of expertise and to think about the ways that we talk about climate change can be kind of inaccessible sometimes. And while the science is super important, I think that there's also an equally important measure of kind of human voices and people being experts in the places that they live and love and know best. And so I was trying to amplify some of that in this work.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love those passages. Throughout this book, you capture the stories of so many people and they stick with you. Like I keep thinking about the dozens and dozens of characters in this book that you've introduced us to, and that power of storytelling. I couldn't agree more. In my work regarding another contaminated water site, not too far away from Ann Arbor, I could share science and numbers and facts and statistics, and you could see people's like eyes glaze over. But when you shared those stories, when you talked about the people and the children and the families and how they were making their coffee and brushing their teeth and using bottled water to cook their dinners, that's where connections were made. And I think that's where persuasion happened. And I guess that, that gets me to my next question. Why did you use storytelling? What do you believe why do you believe in the power of storytelling to make an impact in this existential crisis that we are living through?
Absolutely. I mean, stories are sticky, right? The inspiration for this project came from a bike trip that I did down part of the Mississippi River in the summer of 2013. And I started in Memphis, Tennessee, and ended in Venice, Louisiana, where the river meets the Gulf of Mexico. And along the way, just listened to any type of stories that people had to share with me. And the farther down the river I was riding my bike, the more stories I was hearing about water and climate change, specifically in terms of intensified storms. And I met this one woman named Franny who shared a plate of fried shrimp with me on a really ridiculously hot August day. And she told me about how after the last big storm, many of her neighbors had made the decision to leave this community that they had called home for, in some cases, generations, and that she and her husband had decided to stay. They rebuilt their home as a mobile home on stilts and were, fiercely proud to come from where they came from. But at the same time, there was this kind of precarity, and I couldn't stop thinking about that. Once I got back to the Northeast where I was living at the time. And once I heard one sticky story about climate change, I was wondering what it might mean to put that story in dialogue with stories from other parts of the world, because it seemed to me that the conversation about climate change in general can be numerical, abstract, and a little bit distanced from that humanity of the day-to-day, right? But in reality, it's impacting so many people right now, not only in this country, but around the world. And I thought putting those stories in dialogue with each other might be something of use. So that was the intention. But I think that, on the climate communication side, I think the conversation about climate change has changed so much, even during the time that I've been doing this project. I started recording audio in 2013. And I think that because there are even more extreme weather events now, and also because of a really incredible generation of climate activists who are younger than me, like Greta and others, who have just demanded that this become a part of the conversation on an international level. And so I think that it's easier to talk about climate change now, but we still have so much more work to do in terms of understanding how, in some ways, every story is a climate story.
Yeah, I think not only were you able to capture these heartfelt stories that resonate no matter where you were in the world, that you can resonate with them, but you did this in a very non-traditional way. Like, you literally biked around the world. Like, can you tell the audience, like, why the bike? Like, you must be like the fittest person I have met. You biked everywhere. Like, your stuff was in the back of your bike, and you captured these stories. So tell us more about like the biking part of this, because it is absolutely fascinating and so admirable. It's amazing.
For sure. I mean, so about half of the research for this book I did by bike, to be fair. And if we're talking like point to point, did I circumnavigate the globe? No, but I did a fair bit of traveling.
Every continent is pretty amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, okay, there's so many different ways to answer that question. Bicycles are joy machines. I think it's impossible to feel a sense of despair while on a bike. And I knew that from my own personal experience, but I would recommend riding bikes to anyone, just if you're having a bad day. But in terms of travel and listening to people and conducting interviews, there was something just sort of magic about it that's almost hard to explain. But a bike gets me to the places in between places, right? If I was traveling by other modes of transportation, I would end up in regional hubs, or I would end up mostly in cities and be listening to people there. And I felt really deeply that it would be more important to not go always to those more populated areas, and instead to go to the places between. And perhaps those stories don't get told as often as they might otherwise. And then it was just such a social way to travel too. When I was not on the bicycle, I wore this cardboard sign around.
Yes, I was going to ask about the cardboard sign next. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Do you have one with you?
Version of it over on the other side of the room right now that I can't, my arms aren't long enough to reach, but it says, tell me a story about water on one side and tell me a story about climate change on the other. And that sign was just an incredible conversation starter. I hooked it with like a piece of ribbon or a shoelace around my neck so that I could have my hands free to use audio equipment if people were okay with making an audio recording of a story. But people would ask me about it. They're like, what does that sign mean? What are you doing? And I would say, would love to listen to a story if you have one to share. And my idea at first wasn't to make a book, but was to make an audio map where people could click on a point and listen to a story from that place. And the idea being to put, again, stories in dialogue with each other from different parts of the world. And the project evolved and changed over time, of course. But the cardboard sign was this kind of intimate, bare bones, just way of starting a conversation. And even if people didn't have a story to share themselves, they often knew of someone who did have a good story. And then, suddenly I'd have an annotated point on my map for the next town away to go and call someone up or knock on their door in some cases. So that part was really fun.
Awesome. I love, in the book, you have a line, bicycling is a kind of freedom. And I see, like, in your explanation how it opened doors for you. It also enabled you, I think, to be so much more approachable. Like, oh, here's this, young woman on a bike, and she has this sign around her neck, and she just wants to hear a story. So I love that, and I hope what was missing from the book? I wanted pictures. Like, I wanted to see you. Were you able to capture some of these pictures in these amazing places with your bike and your side?
Yeah, there's a handful of them. And I mean, I guess the hard part about traveling alone is there wasn't always someone to take a picture of me, but if I met someone who was taking pictures for some reason, then that's often where the photos came from. But I also kind of shied away often of taking pictures of other people, in part because I didn't want there to be a machine between my face and someone else's face. I know that I personally can sometimes clam up if I feel that kind of I don't know, I'm in that dynamic as the person who's the subject. And so as the person who is doing the recordings, I wanted to kind of make it as free flowing as possible. But also I'm just limited by only having two hands. If I had a third hand, I could hold video equipment probably a lot more easily. But all of this was also just what I could fit inside my bicycle.
So I loved when you were talking about listening and the power of listening and deep listening. And for me, as a physician, it really resonated because we are taught as doctors to sit, eye level, shoulder to shoulder, and to humbly listen to our patients. Yet doesn't always happen that way. There's machines in between us, like our electronic medical record, and there's all these distractions. And then rather than just letting our patients talk, we're constantly interrupting them, trying to get at kind of what's wrong with them or what they need. But to be a good doctor is to be able to truly listen. And that for me reminded me so much of what you were talking about when you were talking about deep listening. And I'm going to just read some of the things that you wrote. You said, once I started listening to strangers, I didn't want to stop. Verbal storytelling sessions were about holding a space for stories to be told face to face, slowly, and that felt revolutionary. And then you wrote, listening is an act of love. Oh, I love this. So tell us what is deep listening to you, and how you figured out how to do this. How did you figure out just to stop, distractions, and just to sit down and be able to truly listen to that individual?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'll say it's something that kind of emerged slowly over time. And to be honest, I was really bad at it at first. And in making audio recordings, I was able to listen back to how I listened or didn't listen. And on that first bike trip, I so often was really pushy, or I spoke over people, like eager to insert myself or ask a clarifying question. And half of my mind was always on how I would respond or redirect the conversation next. And that wasn't really listening. I think that was talking. So after that, I decided to be a bit more intentional about it. And there's this really incredible article written in 2001, a few days after 9/11, by a writer named Margaret Wheatley that I came across. And she said that great healing is available when we listen to each other. No matter what we have experienced in life, if we can tell our story to someone who listens, we find it easier to deal with our circumstances. Listening is such a simple act. It requires us to be present, and that takes practice, but we don't have to do anything else. We don't have to advise or coach or sound wise. She continued, we just have to be willing to sit there and listen. And if we do that, we can create moments in which real healing is available. And so for me on this trip, it looked like, having a microphone in my hand and creating that space, nodding along, not breaking eye contact. And I knew I was doing it right when people said at the end, like, thank you for listening to me, or it feels so good to share this story with you because I've never shared it with anyone else before. And that happened so often. And talking about things that, were perhaps unexpected for people to feel that way about, but things like water contamination in a hometown water supply, or visiting a coral reef as a kid and then returning to that same reef as an adult and finding it to be bleached, or even losing a family member. There was this one storyteller who's from Afghanistan. We spoke in Kazakhstan, but he lost his brother in a just tragic accident involving boiling water because they didn't have access to like water sanitation or purification at home. And so boiling was the only way. And it was just so clear to me that was important, right? And so I didn't want to stop. And then listening also involves listening to people whose perspectives and takes on the world are different from my own. And but there's a difference between kind of sharing stories and or opinion and offering something that's really aggressive and or vitriolic. And the first is about sharing and connecting. The second's purely an attack. And one carries the potential for a change and exchange, and the other one really doesn't. And so for me, deep listening, it has to start from the premise that we're all equal, we're all worthy of being listened to, we're all human, that everyone has a story to share, that those stories matter, and that we can learn from each other if only we're fully present. And to me, that kind of listening is just so urgently needed in the climate crisis and many other crises we're experiencing as a globe and world and nation right now. But because listening is really the first stop on the way to solution building. But if we're building solutions that don't take into account voices of people who will be impacted, it's dangerous and ineffective.
Yeah. You know, what you just said, I think is kind of one of the biggest take homes of your book is the power of listening. And obviously your book is about water and climate change. But I think that's a lesson that we need right now, like today in the kind of this state of divisiveness that I don't think our generation has seen. You know, death threats because of masks and vaccines and the, you know, all the crazy stuff that is happening right now. Like if we just sat and listened, like truly listened. And I don't think that's happening on any side. I don't think people are really sitting and deeply listening. So I think that's one of the biggest kind of take homes that I got away from this book is that, yeah, you'll learn a lot of amazing stories about climate change and water and why this is so important to all of us. But I think one of the biggest lessons that we can take away is how we all need to do a better job just to kind of be in the moment and to hear each other out.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's great to hear because
we're not there yet. So
yeah.
we're definitely not there yet.
Yeah.
So this book, I don't think this book could be any more timely. You know, we just had this crazy hurricane a couple of days ago. The fires this summer, not only in the West Coast, but in Europe and Greece, those images, the flooding here in Michigan, we've had, you know, record rain and flood after flood after flood, so much so that we've had declared federal emergencies, especially in Southeast Michigan because of the flood. So we, you know, locally are seeing the effects of the climate crisis. And I think, you know, it used to be this distant existential thing, but, you know, it's not so much anymore. So what would you tell, you know, readers, you know, who are finally kind of in this stage of being concerned? You talk about, maybe you can mention, you know, you talk about in the book, these different stages, the alarm, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, dismissive.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that, like you mentioned earlier, there's more people that are now in these alarmed and concerned and cautious stages of climate change than there ever was. So, you know, where do you think we're going to go? Like, do you think there's going to be more action? Do you think because of the kind of the local implications of climate change, we will finally, you know, take action where we haven't in so long?
I mean, I can only hope so. I think that there's just so much work to be done at every level, and for anyone who's just starting to pay attention to these issues for the first time, like, welcome. It can be terrifying, but it doesn't have to be, right? And I think that I get kind of, I guess people ask me about like faith and hope and optimism and things like that from people who have been working on these solutions in a concerted way for just so long. And so know that you're not alone, I guess would be the first thing. But to mention briefly that research that you brought up, so the Yale program on climate change communication has done some really incredible longitudinal studies and surveys about how audiences within the American public respond to climate change in different ways. And so they identified 6 groups that they call Global Warming 6 Americas. And I'd highly recommend reading this research if you're even a little bit curious about it, because it's not like there's just climate change believers and climate change deniers. It's a lot more textured and nuanced than that. And so the alarmed are convinced that global warming is an urgent threat that's caused by humans and strongly support climate policies. The concerned consider global warming to be a serious threat and support climate policies, but believe that climate impacts are still far away, and therefore it's a low priority compared to other issues. The cautious haven't yet made up their minds on whether global warming is happening, is caused by humans, or is serious. The disengaged know little about global warming and rarely or never hear about it in their consumption of media. The doubtful don't think that global warming is happening or believe that it's part of a natural cycle. And then the dismissive don't believe that global warming is happening, human caused, or a threat. Many in this group endorse conspiracy theories that climate change is somehow a hoax perpetuated by scientists or the liberal left. But one heartening thing coming out of this research from Yale is that Americans are becoming more worried about global warming, more engaged with the issue, and more supportive of climate solutions as a whole. And especially from the period of 2015 to 2020, we could see that dramatically. So it's kind of interesting with my own personal experience with listening to these like largely anecdotes of people's stories lines up a bit more with kind of a rigorous research study that's been conducted over time. But I'd say as a whole, we're starting to wake up, but that means looking at solutions at every level, whether that's local or national or international. I'd say start where you are, know yourself, know what your strengths are, and then go from there in terms of what you can do. But there's just so many incredible groups on the ground. I mean, I'm coming at this from a journalism perspective, not from an activism perspective, but there's great organizers pretty much everywhere who are really engaged with these issues on a local level. And I recommend reaching out to them to see how you can help if that's something that's of interest.
Well, I think what I loved reading about was that you kind of came into the climate story not really as a journalist. You were a youth delegate, right? At UN
Yeah.
Climate. That's amazing. So you've been doing this, been interested in this work for quite some time.
Yeah, well, so there's this really incredible group called Sustain Us, and they send youth delegations, and it's like kind of a loose definition of youth. I was in my early 20s when I went, but to different UN conferences, including climate conferences, to kind of advocate within civil society spaces for youth voices. And there's similar groups from countries around the world. And so it was quite interesting because I was there in 2016 in the first week of that climate conference, which was held in Marrakesh, Morocco that year, was the same week as the US presidential elections. So we had a lot of people turning to us and being like, what now? What does this mean for the Paris Agreement? And there was this one Brazilian delegate, youth delegate named Beatrice, who came over and she's like, are you guys the Americans? Do you need a hug? Like, this is going to be really hard. We'll get through this. And I was like, oh my God. I don't think, it's just a really interesting moment. But I, kind of became a journalist over time, over the course of doing this project, really, and realized that there was a career in which I would get to ask people questions all the time. And so that seemed like a pretty fun thing to do. Also, just, communicating complex issues and breaking it down. Metaphor is one of the best tools that we have to do that. And I love being able to wrestle with words in that way. Especially communicating science, right? It's a really fun and interesting creative challenge to make things digestible and accessible, or ask researchers questions that lead in those directions. And so I tried to sprinkle in as much climate science as I could, with an eye towards making it easy to understand, but also maintaining the nuance.
That's awesome. I think if there's anything that we need in communication right now is better science communication, as we are in the midst of significant science misinformation, and the difficulty in kind of just communicating basic science. So I love, it's around kind of 198 in my copy of the book, when you are in 2016 at this climate conference, and you guys or folks had kind of mapped out these 11 items that you guys demanded, and it was for the president or something. It was like the president's list, right? And tell us what it became, like, not the president's list, but
so this was the night of it was November 8th, 2016. Ballots were being counted back home, and we were in Marrakesh, Morocco. And so historically, the US has played a pretty large role in climate negotiations, and justly so, because we're one of the largest polluters in the world. And when we went to bed, it seemed pretty clear that Hillary Clinton would be elected. And the idea of the group was to hold her accountable to the climate movement worldwide. And so several of the Sustain Us delegates, Ben, Deneen, and Orion, got a sheet, and they didn't have a paintbrush, so they took a toothbrush and this black paint. And at some point they gave up on the toothbrush and just moved to bare fingers, and they mapped out these 11 items that were going to be on the presidential to-do list. And those included work for climate justice, respect Indigenous sovereignty, honor the treaties, cut corporate ties, zero by 2050, break free from fossil fuels, commit to a just transition, no corporate trade deals, stop militarism, and inhumane policies, and protect water. But then late at night, deep into making this banner, people had their laptops open to the New York Times election needle that was counting electoral college votes, and the chances of a Clinton victory started to slim. And so as they continued to paint, and then it turned to dawn, and Marrakesh, the call to prayer rang out around the city, and the banner was complete, and Trump was the president-elect. And so the moment kind of felt like it needed something different. So Remy, one of the delegates, had the idea to cross out the word presidential and instead make it the people's to-do list. And that was a banner that got brought to different parts of the climate negotiations throughout that couple week long conference, and then made its way back to the US in other climate demonstrations. And it seemed like just kind of a powerful thing to have a checklist, right, of things to focus on, and to bring that to literally the steps of power in different places around the world.
I think that's beautiful. It is the people's to-do list, and you know, your book brings forth who those people are, and why this work is so important. It's for whom it grounds us. So I love that. That was fantastic. I want to ask you about a little bit about the book writing process.
Sure.
I personally love these questions.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It sounds like you weren't it wasn't your plan to write a book. This was going to be this audio map. So how did it,
how did this happen?
I'm in the same page. I didn't go to medical school and think I was going to be an author, but it happened. So how did it happen? What was the transformation that made you become an author?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of origin stories, and I'll tell a few in hopes that they might be of use to someone in the audience. The first was that around the time that I started kind of the longer global part of this journey, I was invited to join a secret group of women and gender non-binary writers on Facebook called The Binders, that was very active at the time. And it kind of ballooned into tens of thousands of members, and then many sub-binders splintered off from the main binder, it's just an incredible source of mentorship, because that's where I learned how to pitch, frankly. I didn't have a journalism background before that. I loved poetry and creative writing. And my senior thesis, after I had recorded all those stories down the Mississippi River, I wrote in poems. It didn't quite feel right, but I kind of fell into journalism sideways. So after I was keeping a blog and posting a lot on social media, mostly to let my family know I was alive. And then after I'd been traveling for about a year and making these audio recordings, I felt like I had enough to share, or that there were some interesting stories that I wanted to communicate, and to put those together. And so one of those connections from one of the Binders groups helped me pitch a former colleague of hers who was working at The Guardian, who passed my pitch along to an editor at the Guardian Environment section. Again, I couldn't have done this without help, because writing a pitch your first time is terrifying, right? They said yes. And so after that one piece, it became easier to, again, a lot of rejection, but to slowly build up pitches as a freelancer over time. And then the other kind of origin story of it, I was taking, I did this science journalism master's program at MIT that was a year long. And one of my friends in that program kind of dragged me along one day after class to go to an event at the career office. And it was being held by Sam Ford, who at the time had just been hired by Simon & Schuster to start this new imprint called Tiller Press. And he was calling in virtually. There were only 2 or 3 of us in the room, so we got to go around and introduce ourselves. And so I told him about this project that I was working on, and that I was working on making an audio map of the stories. And he said, "Oh, that sounds like a book. We should talk." So
serendipity, I love it.
Yeah, it was really fantastic. And they ended up, not 6 months later, signing on for the book. So I feel super lucky. And it helped that I had already had a proposal prepared for that. Again, the rejection piece. So I had been working with my really fantastic agent, Tim, for a couple of years at that point. And we had sent around in 2017 a series of book proposals to more than 40 publishers, and all of them were no's. And he asked me, he's like, "Devi, do you want to read the rejection notes or not?" I'm like, "Oh, please. Yes, I want to print them out and like tape them on my wall. I want to learn from this." Right. And the comments were really interesting, and helped me shape the next draft of the proposal eventually. But the first piece was that books about climate change don't sell unless you're like Bill McKibben or Naomi Klein, which makes sense, but I also think has changed a little bit as the climate conversation has gotten wider and even more urgent. The second piece of feedback, super on point, was what's going to keep someone turning the pages, right? And the book that I had proposed was just a series of edited transcriptions of these interviews, because I was so hesitant to insert any part of myself into this story. I felt like it would be overwhelming or overbearing or somehow not giving justice. Like I wanted to really honor the stories of the people who had taken the time to share them with me, because I just like believe every story is a gift, and I kind of wanted to just get out of the way. But the feedback from a few editors was like, "Okay, I read a couple of these stories, I feel depressed, and then I want to put it down. What's going to keep you turning the pages?" And so I realized that the book as proposed had no narrative sinew, and that I needed to add narrative sinew, and that furthermore, that narrative sinew had to be me, because I was the one who was listening to all these stories. And I was like, "Oh, darn." So I really struggled a lot with how much of myself to put in, and it felt awkward and hard. And I settled on a balance that felt the best. But I know that was a struggle too. Yeah.
I love the weaving of you and your travels and your path and your well-being and all of that was integrated into the stories. It helped us connect, I think, with you really well. So I love the story of like the why, the origin story. And I think what I took away from that is you need support, that you need a team, a village around you, mentors and friends to help you in this process. You need to be prepared, because you never know when you're going to have that moment and like, here's my ready-made pitch. But also there's so much of serendipity, like and that's about seizing the opportunities, and like being out there and as cheesy as it sounds, networking and kind of making connections to make things happen. So
for sure.
I think those are great lessons.
Rejection is fuel too. Yeah. I actually almost want to turn, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask you a question too, but I'd be super curious to hear what the process was like for you, because I know it's so individual for everyone.
Yeah, real quick, because this is about you, but very similar. Like, I never intended to write a book. I pure serendipity was at an event in Washington, D.C. and ran into my future editor, who was heading up a new imprint called One World at Penguin Random House. And he's like, "Have you thought about writing a book?" I'm just like, "Oh yeah, no, yeah, no, yeah, no." And that's the rest of the story. And I had already had a draft proposal, but it was, crap. And but it was making those connections and having a lot of support with family and friends who are like, "You can do this, we'll help you, we'll help draft this part," so it takes a village to do this kind of work. And I have such a whole new respect for authors. Writing a book is the hardest thing ever. It was like the longest gestation, and it's like, when does this baby come out? And there was so many steps and research and editing. So such a huge respect for anybody who has written a book. It is not easy.
Yeah. Every time I pick up someone else's book now, I'm like, I know how much work went into it. You are like, I loved books beforehand, but now I am like, this is a precious art.
Same.
But to anyone who's listening, I can't recommend Dr. Mona's work and writing enough. So please read her book. What the Eyes Don't See is an incredible work and so important.
Let's get back to this awesome book.
Okay.
The other question I want to ask about book writing is picking the title. So that was probably the hardest thing for me in my book, was picking a title. I had 8 pages of possible titles. I love your title. I love it. I think it's partly because I'm Arabic. My aunt's name is Shahrazad. My daughter's name is Layla. Like, I grew up with the Arabian Nights. So tell us about this title and kind of like what it means to you.
Yeah. So I'm so glad you love it. It was also really hard to settle on one, but the idea for 1001 Stories started really early on in the project and was 100% inspired by Shahrazad. So for people who don't know, she is like the most badass mythological storytelling figure, I think, in world lit, if I can make a claim. But the folk tale has kind of been passed down across generations and hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it goes a little something like, there is a king who his wife cheats on him, and he is irate and beyond irate. He decides to murder not only her, but to have a vengeance on every woman in the kingdom. And so he decides to kind of wed and bed women night after night after night, and then kill them in the morning. And so it becomes Shahrazad's turn to have to go through this fate with King Shahryar. And she decides, because she is a trickster and has her wits about her, she tells him a story and spends all night weaving this incredible yarn that ends at a point of maximum suspense in the morning. And he wants to know what happens next. So he decides not to kill her. And this goes on for 1001 nights, about 3 years. And at that point, they have 1, if not 2 children. And he's like, all right, I'm not going to kill you. And so what really resonated with me about Alf Layla wa Layla, or 1001 Nights, is just the power of storytelling, right? And that Shahrazad is able to use stories to not only save herself, but to change the culture in her kingdom. And that felt just so powerful to me. And so it was a little bit of a joke, right? I was talking with a friend of mine, Sophie, who's also a cyclist. And this was really early on in the beginning of my trip. I think it was in California. And I was like, Sophie, what if I did 1001 Stories, like kind of as a joke, right? And she just turned to me deadpan and she's like, you could do it. Yes. And I'm like, okay. So that was that. And, at first I thought it was only going to be a year, and 1 year turned into 5 years. And it ended up just being this like incredibly transformational journey for me personally, but also, my hope is that this can add and push the climate conversation in just a slightly more human-centered direction, so that we can have, all the incredible science and climate communication that we have that's focused on degrees of temperature change or millimeters of sea level rise, but also have human voices be front and center of the conversations that we have about these issues.
Wonderful. And I think you have achieved that. Well done.
Thank you. I don't know. We'll see.
This is what was missing in the conversation. This is the humanity of it all. These are real people being impacted, and you brought them to life. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. John, I think it's time for audience Q&A.
It is. We have one question in our Q&A box so far, but please don't hesitate to submit your questions if you have any questions for Devi or Dr. Mona. I'll read our first question. It's from a viewer. Stephanie writes, did you gather stories from the next generation, children, that their perspectives differ from the older generations? I ask since children will be living all their lives with the effects of climate change.
I did. Yeah. Only when their parents were okay with it. There was this one, I can read it because it's so short, but it's kind of a beautiful little almost parable from a kid named Jennifer, who I met in New Zealand. And I was on the steps of Te Papa Tongareo, which is the Museum of New Zealand in Wellington. She was 8 years old and visiting from Porirua with her parents. This is my story about water. She told me, once upon a time, there was heaps of water, like at the beach. One day it got so hot that all the water drained out. And then the next day, the water came back. So then this big elephant came and he drank all the water and he took it to this different land that no one knows, she said. And after all the water's gone out of the beach, everyone was getting really hot and everyone walked around and thought there was a desert. Here she paused to look at all the museum goers surrounding us, moving about their lives. Then one day it rained so hard that all the water came back and everyone was happy. So I just thought it was such a beautiful like distillation of what it feels like to not have water and then to have it again. But yeah, there were a handful of kids who just all seemed very on the younger end, like 8, 9, 10, 11, just aware, but kind of telling stories in a way in this like almost mythological voice, which I found to be so beautiful and compelling. And then on the slightly older kid side, I don't know, like teens, there was a really incredible climate activist I met in Norway, who I'm trying to think if I can quickly find her. I guess I'll just kind of paraphrase her story because it's on a bit of a longer side, but this was from a 15-year-old at the time named Martine. And when we spoke in 2017, she was telling me that she grew up in Tromsø, which is a town north of the Arctic Circle. And the group of environmental organizations that she was a part of was suing the Norwegian government for opening up new areas for oil and gas drilling in the Arctic because they've used this as a violation of Article 112 of the Norwegian Constitution, which ensures that every person has a right to an environment that is conducive to health. And so the court ruled in favor of the government in 2018, and the climate activists appealed that ruling, but were unsuccessful. And so she was telling me just about the environmental inaction that she saw at the level of higher up leadership, but also how, she wanting to protect her future was so bravely continuing to advocate against the extraction of more oil, which was an especially difficult thing to do and really interesting to hear her and other people she was with talk about that, because so much of the wealth of Norway is built on oil and people live very good lives because of the oil. But she was conscious that people in other parts of the world were impacted in so much of a negative way because of that. So yeah, kids are great. Powerful voices all around.
Jenna writes, is there one particular story in the collection that makes you feel most hopeful? P.S. You are a rock star.
Thank you. Most hopeful. It kind of changes from day to day, but lately I have been feeling deep hope when I think about the voice of a woman in New Zealand named Tania Tangaroa, and she has spent 20 years restoring a wetland that used to be, it was a landfill site and was unlined at the bottom. And so the kind of birds and other plants were not able to thrive in the way that they once had. And so she and some members of her family and her community have taken it upon themselves to clean up this site and also to have environmental education for mostly the kids in their community to learn more about native bird and plant species. And she was just so connected to the land and really eager to pass along that learning to the future generations, even in the face of dealing with something so toxic. And that was really moving just to see what effort over time can turn into. It's not like she was seeing the results of her labor, one day, 1 week, 1 year later, but after 2 decades, those creatures were returning.
Thank you. We don't have any additional questions just yet from our viewers, but we have a little bit of time left. So Dr. Mona, if you want to maybe ask our last question before we go.
Sure. So what is something that we haven't asked that you would like to share about this book or your journey, or why everybody should go out and buy this book?
I'm trying to think of something we haven't talked about yet. We talked about bikes. I guess I get asked this a lot, so maybe I'm just like preempting it, but people wanted to know what it's like to travel as a solo woman. Yeah. And I will say,
there was a scary scene in the book at one point.
Yeah, I had one negative experience in 5 years, which, I think honestly, being a woman anywhere in the world, it happens, right? Unfortunately. But yeah, it was just an incredible way to have conversations with people. And a good friend of mine, when I was just getting started out, is this filmmaker named Abby Sun, and she makes incredible work. And one of her pieces from like 2013-ish involved her jumping trains close to the US-Canada border and filming what it was like to do that with other people. And I remember watching those films before I went on the trip and being like, Abby, how did you know you could trust the people you were around? And she said that I should follow the 3-second rule. And the 3-second rule is when you meet someone, you decide in the first 3 seconds whether or not you trust them, and you go with your gut. And the times where stuff got dicey or things were a bit difficult were when I didn't trust that for some reason, or I was unable to. And I don't know, I just think it's a great rule in general. And yeah, while I did not have access to some, swashbuckling male travel writer spaces like bars or whatever, and I wasn't going to go out and get, totally trashed and then talk to people. There were really intimate domestic spaces that I was able to have access to because people didn't see me as threatening, right? And so often people would invite me into their homes. And frankly, I think it's why I was able to survive for as long as I did, was just on the generosity of strangers. It was
so much hospitality throughout the
so
book.
much around the world. It's something I'm like really eager to pay forward once it's possible to, be with people again, because it was so sustaining for so long. I mean, the magic of a shower after, not showering for a while is incredible. Small stuff like that becomes so precious. But yeah, there's just so much incredible storytelling that is possible, like sitting around someone's kitchen table. And yeah, I guess in terms of like final messages or things like that, yeah, I think I mentioned this at the top, but I'll say it again, because while I didn't write it in the book, I feel like I'm only coming to understand this now, having talked about it more and more, is that my intention was to kind of break down the idea of expertise. People are experts in their own lived experience, and that there's so much knowledge that's in places, right, where people live. And so by going to places or being where we are and listening deeply to other people can move forward and create solutions that are inclusive and that will move us in the directions we need to go. It's climate change and water as well are just such messy, complicated issues that are really entrenched in place. And so the deeper understanding that we have of what matters to people on the ground, and what changes they're witnessing and what they've experienced, the better we'll be off in the kind of big, massive amount of work we have to do as a planet moving forward.
Awesome. That's beautiful. Storytelling equals empathy, and that's what you've given us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you both for joining us tonight at Home with Literati, for such a wonderful conversation. We're so appreciative. Of course, you can purchase 1001 Voices on Climate Change from Literati, and the link in the chat there. You can also purchase Dr. Mona's book, What the Eyes Don't See. She's now in paperback. Of course, there's links also below me if you're watching us later on YouTube as well. But Devi, Dr. Mona, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you continue to stay safe and be well. Hope to see you in the store in the not too distant future. And to all of our viewers, thank you for joining us as well. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. So have a great night, everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much.